All right, so we are going to kind of switch gears out of photosynthesis for the day, or for the rest of the week, actually, and start talking about the opposite process. So today is photosynthesis or cellular respiration day one. So we are going to kind of do a overview today, and we'll get into some of the nitty gritty details tomorrow. There hopefully will be time for you to finish up the plants in space thing that we did yesterday at the end of class. So we learned all about how plants take solar energy and carbon dioxide and water, and we turn that into sugars and oxygen. Cellular respiration is how organisms get the energy they need from food. So, how do organisms get energy from food? We know that organisms get the energy they need from the food they make or the food they eat. So this process applies to both autotrophs and heterotrophs, meaning cellular respiration happens in plant cells, in animal cells. Um, Nearly all organisms carry out this process. Um, but in order to figure out how organisms get energy from food, we are going to talk about how much energy is in food. The answer is a lot, but it depends on the type of food. Um, depends on the type of food. We talked about glucose, meaning being the sugar that is made in photosynthesis. But we eat more than just sugar, and we consume more than just ATP, right? We've got proteins, we've got lipids, we've got our sugars. A lot of stuff goes into the science of what we eat and how we get energy from the food. We measure energy in calories. We measure energy in calories. That is lower C, calories. One little C calorie is the energy needed to raise 1 gram, yep, of water 1 degree Celsius. So we talked about how heat is a type of energy, and we have decided as a people to measure that energy in the ability to warm something up, or the energy that we put into something. So if we exerted 1 calorie of energy on 1 gram of water, it would raise that water 1 degree Celsius. Now, big C calorie, like the food calories that you see on like nutritional labels, is actually a kilocalorie, lowercase calorie, or 1,000 lower C calories. So a calorie, like you see on a nutrition label, is enough energy to raise 100 grams of water 1 degree Celsius. Is that tracking so far? Gotta do a little physics before we can get into the meat of it, as is the case with biology. Now, 1 gram of sugar, if we were to light a gram of sugar on fire and measure the heat that came off of that sugar, we would get 3,811 calories. Little calories. And that's kind of how we gauge how many calories are in food. We know that if we took a gram of pure table sugar, lit it on fire, and let it burn out until it was just ash, it would release 3,811 calories when burned. Now, 1 gram of triglyceride fat, or a lipid, will give us 8,893 calories. I'm just saying this and kind of pointing it out because we're going to kind of look at the amount of energy that is stored in different amounts of or different things. So on average, carbs and proteins, carbohydrates, release about 4 big C calories per gram, and fats yield about 9 big C calories per gram on average. But when we talk about cell respiration, when we talk about energy and food as energy, we're not thinking about all the other good stuff that comes from our food, all of the building blocks we get, all of the vitamins and minerals and all the other stuff our body needs to function. If you were to live off of, if we were to like bottle ATP and just have you constantly running on ATP, it wouldn't sustain you for very long because the nutrition isn't there. This is just like energy. But cells don't burn food and release energy as heat. Cells don't burn food and release energy as heat. Those measurements that I just gave you is if someone were to just light these things on fire and measure the heat that comes off of them. But cells don't burn food. We're not just like little furnaces. We capture energy in a series of steps. We have a control over the rate at which we break things down and utilize that energy. And those steps are called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process that releases energy from food and here's a little caveat, in the presence of oxygen. So we need to breathe oxygen. Yes, it is because we are carrying out cellular respiration and we need oxygen in order to do that. We use cellular respiration to break down the food we eat into energy. There are other steps, there are other processes that don't require oxygen that we're going to talk about a little later this week. But for right now, cellular respiration is the process that releases energy from food in the presence of oxygen. So if you remember photosynthesis, right, the equation for photosynthesis is 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O with light gives us 6O2 plus C6H12O6. That's photosynthesis. Just I'm going to keep that in mind. Cellular respiration, if we're going to write it in words, we are taking oxygen and glucose and we are taking that oxygen and we are taking that glucose and we are getting carbon dioxide, water, and energy. We breathe in oxygen, we eat sugars and other energy sources. We exhale carbon dioxide, we excrete water in a bunch of different ways, and we use that energy. If we're doing this in symbols, we've got 6O2 plus C6H12O6. Oh, that's not right. We're putting those together, and we're going to get 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. These are opposite processes. Is that a question? Yes. 6O2 plus C6H12O6 plus 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. If photosynthesis is how we take solar energy and store it in sugars, cellular respiration is how we break down those sugars to use that energy. Talked about ATP being the kind of currency of cells. And if that currency is kind of in or stuck and stored in glucose, we still have to break it back down. Because we can't keep ATP for very long because it breaks down very quickly. But we still have to get it out of its little storage whenever we need it. There are 3 stages of cell respiration. Three stages of cellular respiration. I'm going to make these different colors just so we can keep them straight. Step 1 is glucose or glycolysis. Sorry. Step 1 is glycolysis. GLY. Goodness gracious. Glycolysis. Glyco meaning sugar, lysis means to break. So in step 1, we take our 6-carbon glucose And we're going to break it down into 2, 3 carbons. There's a little exchange of energy. Meaning we got to put energy in to get started, but we're also going to get some energy out, and I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. So, glycolysis, we start with glucose, and there's a small energy release. Start with glucose, small energy release. This happens in the cytosol. So when we talked about our cells, right, this will happen just out in the middle of a cell. If glucose enters the cell, we have the enzymes to break it down into 2. So when we need it, we're going to break it down. That's step 1. Following step 1? Step 2 is called the Krebs cycle, or Krebs cycle. It's really easy to get the Krebs cycle and the Calvin cycle kind of mixed up. The Krebs cycle is in cellular respiration. Calvin cycle is in photosynthesis. If you can think of a good mnemonic device for it, I would love to hear it. This happens in the mitochondria. So these 3 carbon sugars, which are actually a pyruvic acid. So our Krebs cycle, we get pyruvic acid in. And we get energy and carbon dioxide out. So just like our first step in photosynthesis was what released the oxygen, the second step in cellular respiration releases carbon dioxide. So this is the Krebs cycle. We've got pyruvic acid in. We get energy and CO2 out. And like I said, this happens in the mitochondria. This is why the mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell. Because in the mitochondria, we are breaking down sugars into energy. Yeah. Yes. Yes, this energy that we are releasing right here is ATP. Good job. All right. So, step 1, we're breaking glucose down into pyruvic acid. That pyruvic acid will then enter the mitochondria where it gets into this cycle. And we'll talk a lot more about the cycle tomorrow. And we're going to release little bits of energy at each step, but it's still not enough. So after our Krebs cycle, we're going to get to step 3, which we are going to call the electron transport chain. just like our electron transport chains that happened in photosynthesis, but instead of having two little ones, we have one big one. One big electron transport chain. From here, we are going to get lots of energy. This is where most of our energy comes from. So we're going to move from our Krebs cycle into the electron transport chain. And we are going to get boatloads of energy. So we've got our sugars that we made by photosynthesis, and now we need that ATP out of it. We need the energy out of it. We're going to break that glucose down into three carbon sugars, because 3 carbon sugars are easier to handle. We're going to chuck it into the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is going to release some carbon dioxide, release a little bit of energy, and then we're going to send some stuff from the Krebs cycle down to the electron transport chain, and that electron transport chain is where we're going to get a lot more of our ATP. So, I talked about oxygen, right? We needed oxygen in order to start this process. Where does oxygen come into play? So, and again, the electron transport chain also takes place in the mitochondria. So, oxygen. We need it to breathe. It's our byproduct of photosynthesis, but we need it for cellular respiration. And we need it because it's required at the end of our electron transport chain. If you remember my discussion about electron transport chains in photosynthesis, right? We started with we said electron carriers were like oven mitts, right? And the electrons were potatoes. And an electron transport chain would be like somebody picking up a potato with an oven mitt, passing it to another person, to another person, to another person, to another person. Oxygen is one of the only elements that can be that last person in that chain. Because as we are losing energy with each step, those electrons are getting kind of weaker and weaker and weaker. And oxygen is really good at taking those electrons when they've lost most of their energy. So, the more energy we need, the more oxygen we need. More energy needs more oxygen. When you are exercising, you are breathing heavier, yes? Is because you need more oxygen, because you need to break down sugars faster and get that energy. Because without oxygen, we can't release that energy from that electron transport chain. That's why we get panty whenever we exercise. So, we have a special name for pathways that need oxygen. Pathways that need oxygen are aerobic. Our Krebs cycle and electron transport chain are aerobic. They need oxygen. If a pathway that doesn't need oxygen So pathways that need oxygen are aerobic. Those are like the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Pathways that don't require oxygen are, I don't know where, my grammar's not working out. There we go. Pathways that don't need oxygen are anaerobic. This is like glycolysis. So, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain are 3 steps in a process. So, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain need oxygen. They are aerobic pathways. Glycolysis doesn't need oxygen to do that first step. So we call that anaerobic. If there is no oxygen available whatsoever, that is when we get into fermentation. Instead of cellular respiration. So if we don't have oxygen, fermentation takes place instead of cellular respiration. That's why, actually, and we'll talk about fermentation a little bit later as kind of an alternate pathway. But right now we're talking about cellular respiration. We're going to the aerobic processes. So, one last little thing before I let you loose, and that is comparing and contrasting cell respiration and photosynthesis. Compare and contrast photosynthesis and cellular respiration. We will spend a lot more time on this specific idea next week as we kind of review both of those topics. But the main ideas is that photosynthesis removes CO2 and releases oxygen. Photosynthesis uses CO2 and releases oxygen, where cellular respiration uses oxygen and releases CO2. They are opposite processes. But there's one little caveat before I just really want to drive this thing home. So, photosynthesis is only done by autotrophs. Yes, only things with chloroplasts can carry out photosynthesis, right? So our photosynthetic bacteria, our plants, all that fun stuff. Almost all eukaryotes, I think unless they do fermentation, which we'll talk about later, will do cell respiration. So plants, when they build up sugar, they also have to have the ability to break it down. So it's not like plants do photosynthesis and animals do cell respiration. Plants do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Animals just do cellular respiration. I'll probably say that a million times, but it's really, really easy to think, oh, plants photosynthesis, animals cell respiration. Mm-mm. Everybody does cell respiration. Only plants do photosynthesis. Cool? Cool. All right. There's an exit ticket on Canvas. If you could fill that out for me, please. Just real quick before we go. And then if you have any other time left, go ahead and work on that plants in space thing from yesterday. When you are finished, please turn it into the bin.